Hello again. Okay, I think there were technical difficulties there for a second, but we should be good now. Welcome, welcome. Please come back. Sorry if that kicked anybody out. Hello, hello again. Sorry for kicking all of you out. Welcome, 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 welcome. Okay, I'm gonna once again try to get Chris to join. There he is. Invite.
Okay, we got it. Hopefully we didn't lose those 12 people from earlier.
Oh my god, Instagram's making us look bad.
Yes, social media manager.
It's all me. I'm sorry, guys. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm happy to not be here by myself anymore. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
How's it going? How are you?
Pretty good. We sent it out this morning, so yeah, my family read it and then sent me this really long thing. It's like, good job, Chris.
Oh, I love that. Do they always read your stuff?
No. For the longest time, my mom didn't even know what me working at the Thai was, and she thought I was volunteering for like over a year.
You're working a permanent full-time job.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, it must feel really great to have gotten the first edition out. I wonder how many people here received it in their inboxes this morning.
Oh, my friend Yute is here. I don't know. I think we're at, I'm sure it's fine for me to share this. We're almost at 3,000 people.
Woo! That's amazing.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I don't know, even when we're picking a title, it's just like, oh, if I'm going to name it like Under the White Gaze, like would some people be like, oh no, just give me the Thai daily newsletter instead. I don't want this one.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the title personally. It's very matrixy. I love it. So let's get started. I'm gonna open up with a land acknowledgement. So for anybody who was here last time, y'all know that I'm not actually in Vancouver. I'm based in Toronto, so I'm gonna acknowledge the land that I'm on here. Toronto is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as you all know, our conversation today is all about communities, cultures, and places, and the people who lived in those places and the generations who lived there before we so-called discovered them. And Indigenous peoples are the prime example of the people displaced in Canadian cities and how colonial lenses erase the true history of a place. And that's kind of what Chris's newsletter is all about. So I'll be keeping that in mind during this conversation. And I'll throw it to Chris for where you're coming from, for your land acknowledgement.
Yeah, so where I'm in, we now call Vancouver. It's pretty ridiculous. There's a park over here, not too far from we call New Brighton Park, and there's this big plaque over there with like the BC flag, and it says "Here Vancouver began." And then it's just like, okay, well, you're saying like this is when history began. So
Right.
where we are is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so let's get into it. For anybody who doesn't know what's going on today, we're doing another Instagram Live to talk about a new newsletter series that Chris has launched. And it launched today. And if you didn't already get it in your inbox, you can sign up for the free newsletter at the link in our Instagram bio. So either after this conversation or if you want to go sign up for it now or whatever, preferably after. Yeah, please go do that so you don't miss the future editions. And Chris, where can people find the first edition if they missed it this morning?
You'll have to beg a friend to forward it to you. But I think we're working on having it a link to it in the subscribe page. So keep an eye on that. Otherwise, if you wait till next week, there will be a link to the first one. But our whole thing about this newsletter is that it's very exclusive. So you have to subscribe in order to see it.
Right. Perfect. Okay, great. So I'm going to do a quick intro to this. Model minorities, exotic eats, immigrant invasions, Tyee city reporter Christopher Cheung here is often worried that he'll become a Christopher Columbus. Journalism demands fresh stories that grabs eyeballs. Sometimes in service to average Canadian readers, he and other journalists often fall into the trap of introducing people and places through the lens of a colonizer. Our latest newsletter series sees Chris hand us a red pill and take us out from under the white gaze. Or does he? This newsletter series of essays isn't just about calling out white journalists, because even BIPOC journalists like Chris have succumbed to the white gaze. So how do we recognize when we're under it and try to see through it? We're live with our city reporter, who's known for his dedication to reflect Metro Vancouver as it is in his coverage. And today we'll talk about the whiteness of the news, how readers can combat it, and we'll also get a sneak peek into the newsletter future editions to come. We'll do a Q&A session afterwards, so please either in like the question box, I think you can submit questions via live, or just in the comments. We have fellow Tyeesters monitoring them, and we'll get to them at the end. So, Chris, when did
my first IG live, so hopefully it'll go well. I know I look very young, but I've never done this before. I don't stream from my home all the time.
Well, I mean, you're usually the one who's behind the Instagram. I only took over.
Thanks to you.
We're happy to have you here. So tell us, like, when did you first join the Tyee? Let's start there.
My first story was back in 2015 when I was an intern. So that's a little bit over 6 years now.
And what was your first story as an intern? What did you first start out writing about?
It was about the history of fishers in Steveston, which is a village in Richmond.
So when you got into the Tyee, I was wondering this when we were preparing for this conversation. Was it city reporting that attracted you to this kind of role, or was it reporting on different communities, racialized communities, as they're very saturated in Vancouver? Or is it just like those two things go together anyways? How did you land where you are?
Yeah, so when I went to J school, I went to the UBC one. A lot of my classmates were like really big news hounds, and like, you know, they would be religiously watching and listening to CBC. Like everybody would be able to name all their favorite hosts and stuff. But I actually never really read or watched the news. It was, whenever I did, it was usually just like over my parents' shoulder, like at nighttime, or my dad, he would bring newspapers home and he would read them cover to cover. But I was never really into that. But I was really interested in exploring Vancouver. So I really like to eat. I really like to take pictures. And I think I told you this before, but like there was a time in my high school when it was a big deal for everybody to drive. And they would just take their parents' cars at lunchtime, and then they would go off to White Spot, buy fish and chips, and then come back and eat it in class. And yeah, so it was like very prestigious if somebody had a car and would be able to drive everybody everywhere. But I ended up, my parents did have a car that I could use, but I ended up failing my license here 6 times. So I was very late to that, and instead it kind of forced me to explore the city in a different way. So by bike, by walking, by taking public transit. So I think by doing that, I started, noticing different neighborhoods and getting really into seeing who actually lives over here.
Yeah.
So yeah, and if you're somebody who likes to eat a lot, I mean, that's a really good way to get to know your neighbors. So I think from there was when I started to really care about what kinds of stories are being told in Vancouver. And so that's why I wanted to be a journalist.
I love that. So it did start kind of as city focused. So when did you start to see that it started to really be about people as well as places? When did that kind of start to become your beat?
I think in the very beginning, like you would see like, oh, well, how come, why is this Taiwanese restaurant that I love suddenly being replaced by like a condo showroom? Or why is, my friend's house now being destroyed, like for another tower? And then so you realize, oh, well, how do people make community where they live? And who really gets to have a say when it comes to what happens at City Hall? And it's the same with Toronto, right? Like if you live here and you're looking around, it's not a surprise who lives in the city. It's a very diverse and very multicultural place. But if you open up the paper or if you look at like City Hall, the makeup is completely different. And I think I started to get quite annoyed early on about what stuff would get covered and what places would get covered. So in Vancouver, you get a lot of the really like hip neighborhoods in the paper. So like whenever something happens in Kitsilano or like Mount Pleasant, it always makes it in. But then, if you go further south, not even going into the burbs, like places like Victoria Drive or like Sunset, that those places never make it into the news, and those people never make it into the news either. And so I think that's when I started to question like, oh, how come these places aren't being picked? And a lot of the times it's like, oh, these are, places that are a bit more middle income or low income or more blue collar, places with more immigrants, more racialized people. Those are the ones that usually, they don't get the coverage. And so that's, I really wanted to get into journalism just to be able to tell those kinds of stories.
Right, right. So tell us, what is the white gaze for anybody who doesn't get it? Explain it to us.
Yeah, I think I've always felt that there was some kind of gaze that was behind the journalism that I was reading. So it's like, oh, well, why are you referring to like members of BC's like Asian community? And like, it's like, oh, members said this and that. And it feels like being a member of the Asian community is like, you'd have a membership, you'd have like a card or something, and meet everybody on the weekend, like for tea. And yeah, whenever they talk about ethnic stuff, there's like this weird assumption that like certain things are not ethnic or certain people are not considered minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a hint of that kind of like divide, but I didn't really know, what was exactly behind that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I clued in to something called like the male gaze, and I think people who are really into art and like movies would have caught on to that. So in film criticism, it's the idea that the portrayal of women a lot of the time is for a hetero male audience. And so there's three dimensions to that. So it could be so it's what I'm calling like the authors. So you might get the director or the people making the movie, who they're the ones shaping the narrative. There's an audience, and so we think of news as neutral, but a lot of the time, like there is an audience that it's being catered to, right? Like if you're, it's like a video game magazine, you wouldn't be explaining to people what like Fortnite or Dota is. And then the third party would be the actors, so the characters that are actually in the piece, or it might be a place as well. And so yeah, if you have, I guess, like a male director catering towards a male audience, and you're presenting like female subjects in it, they might not have a very big role in the movie, or their only role in the movie is to arouse that audience. And so I think that's what led me to think about news in that way, right? Like, oh, like what if we do have somebody who is coming from a white perspective? They don't necessarily have to be white, but maybe they have that white frame on, and then they're catering towards a white audience when they are writing. And then if they are writing about something that is ethnic, then they might be doing a lot more hand-holding or presenting those people from the only way that they know. And so I think those components together led me to, yes, see the white gaze a lot more. And it's like, oh, why is this group considered ethnic, but like this other group is not? And I just started to see it everywhere after that. So not only in stories themselves, but in what kinds of stories are being chosen. So if there's like a model minority, like somebody who's worked very hard at like a diner or some business, and were able to put all of their kids through university, it sounds like a very happy Canadian story, right? And I found this Tim Hortons ad that told something that was like that. So I was like, oh, this is so very stereotypically on brand for like what the Canadian dream is. And then stories of culture like being celebrated in very obvious ways. So you might not ever write about what the Iranian community here is doing unless it happens to be their new year. So, as an outsider, it's like, oh, well, I'm looking for some kind of diverse stories. Like, oh, hey, like people in North Van are jumping over fire as part of this holiday. Like, what's that about? And then they go over there with the camera and put that in front and center. So yeah, I think that gaze, like in the stories themselves, of how like people and places are presented, but also what kinds of stories get chosen at all for a publication.
Right, right. So I think it's fair to say, we talked about this, how like it's called the white gaze, and I think a lot of people know what we mean when we say that, but it's fair to say that it's also a socioeconomic and colonial gaze at the end of the day. That's really where it's coming from. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, some people do call it like a post-colonial gaze, and that has a different definition of where the people who are like on the outside, it's like the colonial or like post-colonial power, and then the subject then is like racialized people. So a lot of big words there, but what that means, and I get into a bit in the newsletter, is that, oh well, if this is Canada, then there's a certain way that newcomers should be like should act. And so if we're doing a story about like a model minority, then the piece would likely talk about how like, oh well, good for this person, they're doing what they should be doing, they're very hardworking, and then kind of leave it at that.
Right. So we talked a bit about how you started to notice it. Can you tell me what it looks like in action, especially as it relates to the consequences of the white gaze? So when you see it happening, and then how that impacts the way that we consume the news and what we walk away from reading your average daily article with.
Yeah, well, I would come across a lot of people who are people who are racialized, and then they would when I ask them like, oh, will you be interviewed about this? They'll be like, oh, like, but I'm not an expert. Like, why would you want to talk to me? And if you want to talk to somebody, like, go ask a professor, or like, why would anybody want to hear what I have to say? And I've talked to other journalists too, who've whenever they encounter somebody who's not used to showing up in media, maybe they don't really know what like English media here is like, but it also feels like kind of random. It's like, why would I suddenly show up and be asking them about their lives and their views on society? And I mean, for us, I guess it's frustrating as a journalist who has to meet like a deadline, right? But for somebody else, it's like they don't really, they don't really see themselves included in media. They don't really feel like they have anything that other people might care to learn about. And I feel like this is something that I guess working journalists have to have blame to take on as well, because if these are people that we're not used to reaching out to, and these are people we're not used to like featuring in our pieces, they might feel that they really aren't important at the end of the day. So that's why I think it's so important for us to reach out of whatever bubble it is that we live in, to make sure that their voices are included.
Right. It's interesting to see like the discrepancy in the way that there are consequences from, I'm just thinking about the example that you gave of the male gaze, which is typically known, as you said, in like arts and film, and how it's about like media representation as well as it is in the white gaze. But with the white gaze in this context, we're talking about like real stories being given in like journalistic news outlets. And you have to wonder how much more fundamentally that impacts somebody's understanding of whether or not they belong where they are in the society that they're in.
Yeah. And I mean, there's different harms. Like this one, I guess it's like erasure is a big one. But it also could be like misrepresentation. And I think for people who might have read my blind spots essay, I talk about this article I came across that was called "Kanji: The New Way to Eat Rice." And you do see that kind of writing happen a lot, like treating something as new. So it might be like a food item in this case, or it might be like a part of town. It's like, oh wow, like this is the first restaurant to come over here in this part of town. But it might actually be that people have been living here for like over 40 years, and there's all these businesses that you didn't see. And it's, I think, probably the most extreme harm is like people feel excluded. So I once interviewed a bunch of business owners, and their restaurants were about to be replaced by a tower, and they were aware of what was going on. They knew that like what City Hall was doing, like they knew what was the timeline that they had. But then when I asked them like, oh well, how do you feel about this? And I thought that they'd be sad, right, to know that they'd be losing like a immigrant customer base that they had. But a lot of them were just like, this is change, and change has to happen, and so we have to accept it. And so I was really surprised, because maybe it's come to a point where even when people are finally being seen in news, they don't really feel that what they say like matters to create change on like a government level.
Right. Right. So I want to ask you about a bit of a journalistic perspective, like from the perspective of the writers. So last year, obviously, Canadian media had a huge reckoning with the way that not only we report on race, but the way that we treat racialized perspectives within the newsroom and how we treat our racialized employees. And nowadays, if you're within like hashtag Canadian media on Twitter, the trendy thing is to kind of embrace the bias that you have. And that's a really good thing. But, you know, there's still like an objective truth that we're after, or, you know, whatever that word even means to journalism right now. So how do we kind of embrace like a relationship with objective reporting in the way that, like we said, your reporting is known for telling stories about how a community actually is and portraying it accurately, but still kind of embrace that bias that you carry, like you're a racialized reporter, but also you're going into communities that you have no familiarity with. So how do you balance that as a writer?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think a lot has changed. Like I haven't been doing this for very long, but in the beginning, it's like objectivity. Like you have to come from, you know, a very unbiased view, like this, you know, view from nowhere, as a lot of media scholars call it. But it's like, oh well, but everybody comes from somewhere. Like even for the pieces that I mentioned earlier, that like might be talking about like the Asian community, or like, oh, who is considered like ethnic, or like what's considered new to which people. So obviously, I mean, you know, you're coming from some kind of perspective. Your readers are coming from some kind of perspective. So yeah, it is, to me, it's very important to be transparent about that. And as journalists, like obviously, we're always going to be writing about some kind of group that we don't belong in, right? But I think we have to be very careful about like, oh well, who are we coming into this, and who are we presenting it to? So that the author and the audience thing that I talked about earlier. An example I like to use is, if you're somebody who doesn't know anything about video games, and then you're writing about somebody who might be playing, you know, on an esports championship, I would imagine that they might kind of belittle something like that. Just like, oh, well, something that people used to do in their basement is now suddenly like this big thing. Like it's so weird. You know, this person doesn't go to school. They dropped out of school to play this. And so I think it's important to think about like, well, when we're coming from like the outside in, like what are we bringing in, right? Like, and it's totally fine, I think, to be an outsider, like walking into some kind of culture that you don't know much about. And we're always going to have to do that, like as journalists. But we shouldn't forget about like the perspective from the inside out as well. So, you know, is this person, you know, if back to the video game example, right? It's like, oh, what kind of community is this person building? It's not just like a lonely thing that this journalist might think about, right? And what are the choices that led, why are they making these choices to pursue this thing? What is the kind of lingo that they talk about, like on the inside? So I think there's something valuable, like somebody coming from the outside in and like taking a reader who doesn't know too much about this world, about this kind of community. But there's also something valuable too, say like we're getting a journalist who is a gamer, who knows about it, and then they're writing it like from the inside perspective. And so I think we need both, right? Like don't forget about the inside out when you are coming from the outside in.
Yeah, of course. And I think this is such a relevant question in general because there's such an increase in young journalists and young creators in general wondering whether they have the right to cover communities to which they don't belong. Like for a few years now in a row, I've been to this student journalism conference called NASH. And one of the most common questions we get every year is, I'm a young white journalist. Am I allowed to cover Indigenous issues? And I think it's something that's increasingly on like this generation of journalists who's inheriting the landscape. It's increasingly on their mind. And I appreciate the not black and white answer to the question because I think both perspectives matter so much.
Yeah. And it's like it's fine not to know something. It's fine to make mistakes, like that's gonna happen, but it's about the attitude, like when you're coming into it.
Right. Yeah. When we were talking last time, you were saying really check the attitude at the door. I think you were saying like what attitude you're going in with.
Yeah. Like I see that a lot in restaurant reviews, but I feel like it can also apply to journalism. Like if you're somebody who's going to, like a more like blue collar diner, you're not going to be like, oh, like how come they didn't refill my coffee? Like how come, I just like seat myself like in this place. It's like, you're not expecting like 5-star service like when you go to a place like that, right? Because, you're going to be entering a lot of spaces that aren't created for you. And there's going to be norms that you might not be used to. It's like, we can't expect the same kind of treatment when we are going into a place that is new to us.
Right. So if anybody here is just kind of joining recently, I see that we have some new viewers. We're talking about our newest limited run newsletter. It's called Under the White Gaze. It's by our very own city reporter here, Christopher Cheung. And you can subscribe for free at the link in our bio if you haven't yet. So, Chris, can you tell me about a time that the white gaze was super potent and saturated on an article, but you did not register it until after the fact? When did the white gaze really get you?
Okay, this is an example from the very. I hadn't even started J school yet. Okay, so this was like my very first internship that I did back in 2014, and there's always those articles that want to talk about like the up and coming like neighborhood. What's the new happening place to be? And then so in Vancouver we have this street, Fraser Street, and then around that time, Ernest Ice Cream, if you remember, like had just opened there. There was like a tattoo parlor, like a lot more restaurateurs were beginning to choose this place because the rent was a lot cheaper. And they're like, oh wow, like this is the new like happening place to be. And then so I wrote a piece about that. And I talked to a lot of these new business owners. Like I talked to a leasing agent who was just like, yeah, like this place is beginning to heat up. And I had a word in there that I said that this neighborhood didn't have an established name until like this wave of businesses came in. And then it was called, they called it the Fraser Hood. So, sometimes neighborhoods will get like a new name like that. Mm-hmm. And what I did not notice until later on was that, oh, well, it actually did have an established name. And the name was actually on these banners that were all the way down the street. And I didn't notice that at all. And it was called Mountain View. But I think the even worse thing that I didn't know was that like, oh, this was a like quite important immigrant place to a lot of different groups. So in more recent decades, there's a Vietnamese newspaper that's over there. There's a Polish community center that's over there. There's a lot of Filipino businesses over there as well. And yeah, when I was, in that original piece, when I was saying like, oh, this is a new place, this place, nobody had come here before. Right. Nobody had ever built anything before. I'd kind of, erased the fact that like, oh, well, actually a lot of people did come here like for community and for like really important, everyday things. And so I tried to atone for that later on. I wrote a piece about like neighborhood rebranding and what happens when like new money comes in and erases an older place. And earlier I mentioned, what happens when like a city comes into a place that has different indigenous groups and says like, oh, the Vancouver began now. And so I feel that happens a lot where there's different parts of town where, there is like a new craft brewery or like a new condo development. And so a lot of the time, like it's money that's behind that. But there's also a dimension of like, of race as well, because like, oh, well, these people who did form some kind of livelihood over here, we don't care about that because this is the brand that we want to sell.
So what would you say was the mistake there? Like, what do you think that you do differently now from that experience in reporting on new places?
I think be more skeptical. Like I got, you get really caught up. It's very easy to get caught up in that, like that new energy, like that hype energy of like, oh, wow, this delicious artisanal ice cream that uses, like spruce bud, like in their flavors, or like there's a cool like bar over here. But it's like, oh, well, I don't think I actually spend too much time over there or even bother to do too much like reading. And so sometimes just like reading about the history is really important too, because you get a different perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So go to the actual place and look around, which I did not do. And I did not see that.
I mean, it's a great tip for many people who still don't kind of engage physically with the places that they're reporting on, especially now with COVID. It's so much easier to, like you said, it's so tempting to just fall into this like voyeuristic kind of approach to journalism. And we were also discussing, was it Jesse Winters' article?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, do you want to tell people a little bit about what that piece covered, more from the photojournalism perspective?
Yeah. So when I started this, I got a couple of emails of people saying like, "Oh, like why are you talking about the white gaze? There's so many different gazes. Like, you might have an Asian gaze. Like, someone might have a Spanish gaze. So many gazes. Why are you focusing on this one?"
Yeah.
And then so I did more reading about that, and then usually when people talk about some kind of gaze, like the male gaze or the post-colonial gaze or the white gaze, there's some power dynamic that's behind it. Because whoever is controlling the narrative will have the ability to shape how some subject is presented. And so aside from, the white gaze, which I've noticed a lot in media, I think there's also a privileged gaze that's at work. So there's a lot of stories that are about like stuff that affects property values. So that might be like an ugly art installation, or broken windows, stuff like that, but that makes people clutch their pearls. And of course, there's a lot of overdose deaths in the downtown east side over here in Vancouver. And I mean, drugs has been an issue for years, but the coverage of it a lot of the time, I think, comes from that privileged gaze, because even purely from the photography, you get pictures of needles and puddles, stuff like that. That's used a lot of the time, like a needle going into somebody's arm, or like police cars, police tape, and it's shot like very far away with a telephoto lens. And so I think all of that, it's very like dehumanizing, and it's very much, it stokes the fear as well. But the most important thing is that, the people who are actually the center of this piece, they don't get interviewed at all, and they don't get presented at all. Like tent cities is a thing that gets covered a lot over here as well. But a lot of time the photography for that, again, it's like the telephoto from very far away, and it's like shooting pictures of like, people's trash. And so if you're a reader, you're coming into it, you're not going to be going into it and be like, oh, is there a privileged gaze like at work in this story? Like, who's this journalist and who are they writing to? Instead, they'll just be like, oh, it's garbage. I see garbage. Right. This is a bad thing that's happening. These people are dirty. But you don't go deeper. It's like, oh, well, who actually lives here? How come the city isn't helping in like taking their trash away? Like those kinds of questions. So it's like it's not the people who are in the piece, like they're not the ones being catered to. It's like people from the outside.
Yeah. Right. And I really loved that piece because it took this concept that we're talking about into a very kind of physical aspect of the conversation, which in one of the examples that Jesse was writing about, it was like a telephoto lens, which is like one of those lenses that are this big, and just kind of having your classic photojournalist taking a picture of the tent city from across the street using your super zoom camera lens. And I think that's like the perfect example of how journalists are sometimes just don't bother to engage and get a genuine connection and understanding to who they're reporting on.
Yeah, it's so obvious when it comes to visuals. What happened was Jesse Winter, one of the Thais photographers who works for us a lot, he did this piece called like Beyond Needle and Puddle. Right. So it's like, how then do you stop using a lot of that very impersonal stuff and then centering the people instead? And I think, that happens a lot with different marginalized groups. Like I see a lot of stories that might have nothing to do with Chinatown at all, but some aspect of Chineseness. And then there'll be someone going in with like a telephoto lens and like taking pictures of like, dried shrimp, like or like lanterns or something to like symbolize like Orientalism. And I think it functions in that same kind of way, right? Like if the reporting is not personal, a lot of the time the visuals aren't personal as well. And it's just so obvious, like who's this person who's coming in to snap a photo? It's somebody who is like photographing from the outside.
Yeah. And I think like very, very slowly, like the public is also gaining a bit more media literacy, because I think that like even something, what you were saying reminds me of very early on when COVID cases were just starting to happen, and every like at least from where I'm at, like every CP24 and blog TO articles featured image was of an Asian person, an East Asian person wearing a mask.
Yeah,
And
it's the same here too, airport.
yeah, and I think that very quickly that got called out. Like, why are we using these random citizens on the street who are very specifically East Asian wearing masks to represent a pandemic? And that just it's like not very far off of calling it a China virus, right? It's like basically the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like if you're like people don't think about this. Like when you're reading the news, like if you see, as I mentioned, like oh you see garbage, it's like oh this is a dirty place. You see a photo like somebody East Asian wearing a mask. It's like, oh, this has something to do with them.
Yeah.
And so that's why the onus is so much on the journalists to make sure they're making responsible choices.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So where do you think the white gaze is thriving the most? And as in what kind of media? And should readers be reconsidering the publications that they're reading from on a regular basis? Or should we be kind of looking to increase our media literacy?
Yeah, cancel everything else. That's not the type.
Advertise Instagram.
I think so. I mean, less than like naming publications. I think it's stuff that's made really, really quickly, and that's a function of like the media models that are out there too. So it's like, oh, like we need as many eyeballs as we can, and so I think unfortunately, like when journalists don't get the time to put out a story that has a bit more thought and like talks to the sources that are centered in it. I think it's a lot of those tropes get relied on a lot, right? It's just like, oh, this is a deviant person who's like racialized, or like, oh, here's another model minority story, or like here's another like cultural celebration with like cultural symbols in it. But like that's kind of all there is, and so it's sad that that's a function of deadlines. So I would hope that people would crave like coverage that's like a bit more in depth, and so like pieces that take longer, people take longer to read them. And aside from just like news media, I see a lot of those kinds of stereotypes like baked into like TikTok as well. We were talking about like restaurant reviews with that weird robotic voice that people use. That's just like new, authentic, hole in the wall, like new ethnic food.
It's a great
but it's just like, okay, well, people aren't going to see that and start thinking about like media criticism, right? It's just like, oh, well, why are you calling this place like authentic? Like, why is it a hole in the wall to you? And so I think even in something as like innocuous as TikTok, that kind of gaze like can creep in because it's catering towards somebody who's like, oh, this is somebody who's a foodie, somebody who's a consumer. And then so when they're going out into the city, they have that attitude that like, oh, I'm going to go into this poor area or this racialized area to discover something and to consume it. But they're not really thinking about like, oh, well, why am I viewing this place in that kind of a way?
Right. Yeah. It definitely feels like a product of the internet and kind of giving everybody access to everything all the time rather than kind of localizing our perspectives a bit more. That's really what TikTok does a lot of the time. For anybody just joining, I'm going to repeat it again. Our free new limited run newsletter, Under the White Gaze, is available to sign up for at the link in our bio. And this just in, the first edition for anybody who didn't already sign up and who didn't get this morning's first edition is available at that link too.
For free. It's free.
So, go sign up for that. So Chris, how can we combat it? What are we going to do about this?
I think we all need to investigate ourselves. And what I talk a lot about is like mental maps. So it's like, where are the places that you go to a lot, like for everyday stuff? What are the places that you might consider like a sketchy part of town or like an exotic part of town? And why do you feel that way? Like for me, I eat way too much meat, and so I wouldn't be able to tell you where any of the vegetarian places in the city are. And so I personally have like that kind of like fog or like those blind spots towards like vegetarian restaurants. And I feel like a lot of people might have like a similar kind of fog about a different kind of world that they might not be a part of. So maybe it's a place that is like an ethnic enclave in their lives and so on. And so I think the most important thing is just to go out and explore. go out and go to those places and like see who actually lives there. And I think by doing that, a lot of the time our impressions of it get challenged. Like when I was growing up, like I said, I didn't watch much news, but the few like clips of like evening news I would see was to do with like Surrey and like, you know, gang violence with like guns.
Yeah.
And then so from very young, like a lot of me and my peers, like we had that impression of Surrey, and we'd say, you know, like really awful stuff like better safe than Surrey, ha ha ha.
Oh
so I had no idea what this place was like at all. And then so I mean later on, like when I was older, and then I would like go out and take the bus there, go out and take the train there. You can see how people live, and this is so bad, but it's like when you go there, it's just like, oh wow, like I went there and I'm okay, I'm fine now.
Yeah.
But I think as I started to go there more and more, it's just like, oh well, you see what kind of a place this is, and then you see that you know, if you've seen that movie, like 500 Days of Summer, there's like the expectation, and then there's like the reality. And so I think sometimes there is a side of it that's like, it's the media imagination's version of a place, and then there's like the actual place. So it's very important, I think, to go and see how places actually are. And a lot of the time, because if we've done a bad job as people who work in media, then there is that kind of a shock that a place is a very, very different way than we might have thought.
Right. So we're down to our last couple of questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. If anybody has any, please put them in the comments below. My fellow Thaisters are standing by and writing them down. So Chris, why did you want to put together this newsletter series? Why is this your chosen medium? Why did inspiration strike for you in this topic?
Yeah, I think that just came to a point where like whenever I write a story, I do have a lot of about things that people might consider like diverse. And I feel like if other people in my position too, like they feel like there's a lot of roadblocks, right? It's just like, oh, should I be calling this group of people like a community? Like how should I be describing them? And is there any, when I'm interviewing like a group that I'm not a part of, like am I doing something in the writing that you know, really highlights like that difference, the fact that they're like this other. And so I wanted to explore a bit about, you know, why that is, and what goes on, like behind the scenes of somebody who is a journalist coming into that. But yeah, and so at first I thought like this was just going to be a series about like representation, about getting the places and the people that I'm used to seeing like in the city, like in my everyday life, in the news. But then I started to think about, oh, well, if that's the case, then like why is there a dimension of it where certain stuff is considered normal? And then the other day I caught myself writing like the term like mainstream Canadians when I really actually meant white Canadians. And so I was like, oh, like why did I do that? Like why did I think that, you know, white Canadians are mainstream and everybody else is like, I don't know, other or different? And then so I guess I was personally quite shy about talking about like the white gaze and like race in that explicit way. But with some of the responses that I get to my pieces, they're like, oh, well, why are you talking about identity when we should be talking about like climate change or like capitalism? And then so I was just like, oh, well, how come when I mention race, like people are telling me to essentially like be quiet and write about something else, right? So I think that's why it's worth it to explore. It's like, why is there certain kinds of diversity that we are allowed to write about, and other kinds that like when we cross a certain kind of line, it's like, you know, we're told to be quiet. And I you know, you see so many pieces that celebrate some aspect of multiculturalism in Canada. But then a while back over here, there's a bunch of stories about how Richmond, the city, had too much Chinese on their signs and ads. And I was just like, oh, well, I thought we loved people using different languages and stuff like as part of the Canadian brand. But how come when people do it too far, it's literally called like un-Canadian, like in the story. So yeah, like I wanted to explore that and what really goes on like behind the scenes of these stories that we put out. And it's like, it's not just a matter of like it being on print or like it being like on a screen, but this shapes how people see the world, right? It's like, you know, me avoiding a city like Surrey because of stuff that I watch the news. A lot of the impressions that we have of people, of places, and of cultures, like all of this comes from media, right? And as I said, like if I'm looking at a photo of like garbage at a tent city, I'm not going to be like, like I wonder what life is actually like over there, I'm gonna have negative feelings towards it. So that's why I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And I know that, it's kind of, one of our colleagues was referencing it as kind of like almost like a teacher's package, because I know that there are kind of discussion questions at the bottom, or like prompts of some sort, to get people thinking about how this isn't just like a media writing or creating problem. It's the consumer's responsibility too, to also think critically. And I saw that somebody had brought up wanting a sneak peek, which is great timing, because I would love to ask you for a sneak peek into one of your favorite newsletters, maybe, or whatever's to come in the following editions.
Yeah, I mean, there will be a food one. There's one that goes to a museum, which I talked about in the preview. But yeah, one of my favorite ones, which is, I think it's the fourth one, is on, I think I'm calling it like Here Be Dragons. And so it's the idea that like when we do have like a mental map, what are the places that do have that fog over it that people don't know about? And yeah, after like the whole Fraserhood thing, I found a piece recently that talked about this part of town as having like absolutely nothing there until this craft brewery moved in. And so sometimes it's not the journalist's fault, but then the people that they're quoting will say really ridiculous things. And then I feel like then it's the journalist's fault if they include it without much context. So this business owner talked about there's nothing in this area, people in the area really craving like a sense of community. And so we want to come over here and be first, and like to really put they literally said like to put our stake in the ground, which I thought was such a colonial like image of like, flag planting.
Yeah.
But this was a part of town that's like, there's like 2 like performing arts venues. There's a noodle production facility. There's like a kimchi factory there. There is an industrial facility that makes like phyllo pastry for all of the bakeries in the region. And like tons of bubble tea, tons of karaoke. And I was just like, oh, well, how come like this person's coming in here and said like there's nothing over there? And so I dive into that, and also dive into it in the bigger scale as well, of like, oh, when we talk about when places like begin, like what do we mean, right? Like when it comes to a city as like being the start of a place, what about like the millennia of history before that? And yeah, it's like it's kind of freaky to see that these like colonial ways of like looking at place still exist now.
Oh yeah. Well, let's take some questions now. Let me see. Okay, so some of my colleagues have graciously written some on the side for me here. So please pour in any cues that
you are racist, Chris.
That's not a question.
Don't write about race.
Okay, so one of our questions says, I love the newsletter this week. I feel like it should be mandatory reading J School. Oh, this one we kind of already answered with the sneak peek, but there is a secondary question here. So I love the newsletter this week. Feel like it should be mandatory reading for J schools everywhere. LOL. Same. Was wondering where you were thinking about taking this newsletter next.
We will put it on the tyee.ca, like the actual site. I don't know. I guess depends what would be helpful for people. I know in the past when we've had some Tyee series that we've turned into like a PDF and passed it around. So we'll see where the interest is. But this is going to be like a limited run. So we're going to be having it out every week until mid-December. So it's a bit more self-contained, and I'm done like half of them already. So yeah, I'm not sure what's next, but if you have an idea, do let me know.
So newsletter reader Patricia asks, I am thinking a lot of how to move beyond the white gaze in journalism, social media, and in academic writing. I have a tremendous desire to learn what was not taught when I went to school in the 70s and 80s and during my undergrad in the 90s. Yet I wrestle with finding new ways to write that do not replicate the white gaze. Any advice?
It is really tough. I think this is kind of answering the question tangentially, but I think some people have taken what I've talked about and thought that it means that like we should get rid of like the white gaze and never write about like the white gaze at all, or be beholden to the white gaze at all. But I feel it's inevitable that when we do some kind of public communication like journalism, there's always going to be some outside audience, whether it's people who are white or whatever else. And so I think what I would hold to is like the inside out thing. So, for example, I was talking to Duncan McHugh, who is a journalist at CBC, and he was saying how it's great when you get stories from within some kind of group that like people from outside would never be able to guess. And so he gave me one example, and it was about why Baby Yoda was embraced by Indigenous people when The Mandalorian came out on Disney Plus. And he said, like if you're not Indigenous, you'd be very confused. Like, why are people clinging to Baby Yoda? And then he explained that, people have always compared Yoda to an elder-like figure, and Baby Yoda is just cute, and so that's why. But it's like, yeah, like something like that is like it's very unexpected, and unless you talk to people who are actually like within some kind of a group and get on the inside, like you would never be able to know that. Like I wouldn't have been able to guess like Baby Yoda as a story to be covered. And so, but at the same time, it's just like, you wouldn't just write about Baby Yoda and not explain like why he's important. So there is an aspect of the white gaze in that story, which you can see on CBC, and that like, oh, you do need to do some work as journalists are a kind of a cultural interpreter, kind of an ambassador to be able to build that bridge, right? And so, yeah, it's not about like getting rid of the white gaze entirely, because there will be some kind of explanation like needed, but who's being like centered like at the heart of the story? Like, is this a story that's just meant for somebody to be able to come in like and tour a place or to experience something? Or is it actually something that people are living and are part of society, and that we need to get out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can take one or two more questions. Newsletter reader Jacob asks,
is that my newsletter editor, Jacob?
No.
It's not a planted question, I promise.
Okay, tips for recognizing the white gaze when you're reading news stories in your community.
That's a good question. I think spotting those kinds of adjectives is, it can be very subtle. Like I read a story the other day that was just about like a ramen shop that had opened in North Vancouver, and they spent 200 words from the perspective of the author talking about his experience in Japan and how he loves the sound of the language. And I was just like, who's this story for? Like, I thought we were like talking about like this ramen, right? So
yeah,
I don't know. It's so hard, but like, yeah, I think breaking it down by those three parties that I talked about, like who is this author, right? Like, if it is something that is supposed to be an impartial piece of news, like 500 words reporting, can you have a hint of who this author is? And also, like, is there a specific audience that's being written to? And I think those perspectives a lot of time will then define like who the actors in the actual piece are. Like, if we're writing about homeless people, does a homeless person never show up in it, and instead we just talk about land values and people who own like property nearby? So yeah, like, who are the subjects that get included? Like, what the headline looks like, what's the overall tone of the piece? I think, yeah, by breaking it down in those components, you can have a pretty good idea of what the gaze is behind that story.
Those are all amazing tips. We got another question from newsletter reader Andrea. I think sometimes
Andrea, another Thai staffer?
No. Stop calling me out, Chris. So I think sometimes gearing to the white gaze means we get stuck in really 101 level conversations. I definitely really relate to this question. What does moving beyond that gaze allow us to do in terms of making conversations more complex?
Yeah, a piece suddenly becomes more universal, I think. Like, there's a lot more, we learn about like some kind of group, like we learn about something that we don't know, right? Mm-hmm. Like the Baby Yoda thing, it can be super surprising. Mm-hmm. And journalists always say, like, don't read the comments, right? Because the comments are usually very nasty. And so if I've written stories about housing where suddenly people talk about Chinese like money laundering. And I would never have mentioned like race, ethnicity, or culture or whatever in the piece. But it's like, oh, well, why is this person bringing this up? And I feel like the media has come to a point where like if all of the stories like we're talking about a particular topic like housing is all about some kind of like criminality to do with people from some kind of a place, then unfortunately that's the feedback we're going to get from readers. And so I think there's a responsibility, like if we want to see that kind of better discourse, we need to like put out a diversity of stories. Like, oh, well, how come whenever we write about this particular people group, it's always to do with crime? And so, yeah, I think whatever we're putting out there, I think that's how readers are responding. And so we shouldn't just be like, oh, well, these people are unreasonable and we shouldn't read the comments, but we should think about like, like what have we published recently that might make people think in that certain way?
Yeah, and not to kind of toot our own horns here, but I think that the Tyee has a really incredible audience for that. When I first joined, like that was what I noticed right away. People were just always kind of engaging in good faith, and even the people who aren't engaging in good faith, we try to extend that side of ourselves to them, and like you said, hold ourselves accountable in our readers' understanding of issues. So I love that. I love taking that taking of responsibility. I think that's it for our conversation today. Thank you to everybody here who joined in to listen. Thank you, of course, to Chris, who put together this incredible series. I can't wait for every new edition to come out and to give it a read. Chris, where can our viewers sign up for the newsletter series one last time?
You can go to thetyee.ca. It is free. There should be ads like everywhere. You can Google it and you can find it. If not, you can just reach out to me and I will help you sign up personally.
It's also in the link in our bio.
Oh, it's in the link. Is that what you were priming me to say?
But all of those places too. Again, thank you everybody for being here, and we'll see you at the next live. Bye, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Bye. Bye, everyone.